Hello, and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where you'll hear from thought leaders in a wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows about. This podcast will introduce you to people who are paving the way for a better future for us all. They'll give you hope for the future and many practical tips on how to handle life's ups and downs. The insights in this podcast will help you make a leap or two forward every week for yourself. I'm Dr. Linda Ulrich, founder of Ever Widening Circles. Since 2014, we've written thousands of articles about people who are innovators and insight givers all around the world, opening a new era for us all. And along the way, we've had these wonderful conversations with these thought leaders that we're now recording and sharing. Because what I've noticed is people who are doing extraordinary things in the world, they have a vision of the future that we don't have yet. And I get them on the podcast and I ask them to share what they know that gets them up every morning and excited about a brighter future for us all. So today we're talking to an amazing thought leader who I've known for a few years and who she and I dream big together whenever we get on phone calls. It's like 2 hours later, we both feel like we're flying on a cloud. Um, Maureen McKenna is so many things. I'm going to start out by introducing her as a bridge builder and a business mentor. But just a moment ago, I asked her how she'd like me to introduce her, and she says, well, I have this new thing. I'm a positive and eclectic explorer. Now, that word positive, there's a common denominator between the two of us that we're going to get into in a few minutes. But Maureen, welcome and tell us more all about this adventure you're on.
Well, thank you. Delighted to be here. And as I say, the energy we had from the moment we met was just striking. And my business is actually called Return on Energy, ROE. And so I love being with people that I feel just fill me up. And you're certainly one of them. So I was laughing as you were saying the bridge builder and connector on my LinkedIn. I talk about my job is to help people be more human and productive at work. And I've now been expanding just in the last couple of days because you and I shared this thing around pause. So when I talk about being a positive and eclectic explorer, positive is PAUSITIVE. So, and I even one of my young mentees gave me this necklace and it has the pause button on it to just remind me that that is an important part. So I feel at this age and stage of myself and in the world, we need to pause. And that's why when I was listening to your TED talk, I'm like, wow, we're so aligned. And then eclectic. And I began to think, what's nice about getting older, I just turned 68. I love the idea of being eclectic. I've always wanted to be eccentric, eclectic old lady. And so I think what you and I cover over is that we cover on many different aspects and we can kind of bring them together. And then this whole idea of explorer, and I came across a great definition, I'll share if you don't mind, and I found it on an Australian website, a government website, and it said, when you become an explorer, you become enchanted by learning, you discover a love of finding new knowledge and sharing this precious info with others. And I feel like that's my passion, and I believe it's what you love to do. So that's who I am. I'm a positive, eclectic explorer.
Well, I tell you, that whole connection between our work about the power of the pause, and that's what my TED talk is called, the power of the pause. Um, this is something that you and I have probably dabbled around the edges of in our many conversations, but it was just recently that I realized you had that going on in your message. And in these times when things are easily upended. Everybody's just trying to find a new way forward as the pandemic is still so pressing. Now you're talking to me from Toronto.
I am.
Yeah, and the pandemic here in the United States, I live in Vermont. We just hit 80% vaccinated yesterday. But it's not the same all over the world. It's just a huge spectrum of experience still, right?
Hmm. In fact, I just got my hair cut the other day, and strictly speaking, the salons are not going to be open for another 3 weeks, but my hairdresser cut my hair outside, and she had not cut hair since November 20th. So we've been in lockdown in Toronto since November 20th, and then in the province. So it is, and I do work with Michelle McQuaid, who's out of Australia. And so at any point in a workshop, we might have someone from England, someone from Thailand, someone. And so it's fascinating when we started how similar we all were last March, but
Yes.
the experience is changing.
Yeah, and that's where I like us to take this conversation today because life is always going to be always going to be more vivid for us all after this experience, right? We're going to appreciate, we're going to be grateful for certain things we just took for granted before. We're going to be more disappointed by things that we've learned to appreciate, and we're going to grieve the loss of things differently. So, the spectrum that we are going to all be operating on for quite some time, maybe forever, will be different than before.
Mhm.
And that's what's always impressed me about your work is that, no matter what idea you and I might bring up, we 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 seem to find, oh, and I always find it helpful to look at it this way, and you always say, well, I find it helpful to look at it this way, and there's enough going on there that might be helpful to others that I thought we should share just an ordinary conversation between Mo and Dr. Linda.
Well, I love it. And I think it comes back to we share probably that eclectic, but yet focused at times. So it's a both and. So I love it. So
Yes. Yes. Okay. So, so Mo, today you've shared with me a wonderful, a short video, a synopsis of your feelings about the life of one of your best colleagues, and in it, you talk about how when things go way wrong, it's easy to say, ask ourselves why questions.
yes. Yeah.
And then there's an alternative, a group of better questions than that. So let's start there because every day, I don't know about you, but almost every day I wake up to a new hair on fire situation. And I'm I and they're outside my control. It's not like I'm creating chaos. Tell us about this why questions versus another alternative.
Sure. I'd be happy. And what I love is that I love that the explorer part that says, I'm going to tell you about something. And guess what? I'm going to say, here's a link to go and learn more about it because I have a really good memory. It's just not accurate.
Mhm.
But in the moment, I think it's right. So, or I'll change. I mean, I think that's the other thing that's so important is what I say to you today is how I'm feeling, but I may say something different tomorrow. And I think that's an important part to recognize. So this is something I've been exploring. My dear friend, Dr. Danny Friedland, and he has, let me just give a little bit of background. He's unusual in the sense that he's a medical doctor. He wrote the first book on evidence-based medicine in the late 90s. So has a very methodical, scientific approach, taught thousands of doctors about this approach. And then about 10 or 12 years ago, began to feel, actually, he shares, he went into a depression and he said, we've got to look at the holistic part of a person, not just the typical medical. And so that led him to write a book, and it's let me just think what it's called. It's Leading Well from Within,
Mm,
and it's a neuroscience and mindfulness based framework for leadership. And so he's so unusual in that he's starting to bring in these differences. And a lot of what he's focused in on is the triggers that set us off. So when you were saying you wake up in the morning, what happens is, and I know this has happened to me, someone very close to me, something unexpected happened and we couldn't have predicted it. And I go, oh, why did I do that? Why did, oh, and I start using questions that start to almost beat myself up because they're based on the past, which I cannot change. I can only learn from it. And so Danny's whole thing is if you don't want to fall and trigger the amygdala, if you want to move into, and he uses Maslow's hierarchy, if you want to move into the tend and befriend to get to the executive functioning, you've got to ask a different question. And so what he talks about is the why. It moved from the why to the what, because the what is around being open, and it gives you that chance to kind of swim and see an opportunity. And in the short story that I shared that you heard this morning, and we can put a link to that, Danny in his early, just 6 months ago, was diagnosed with stage 4 glioblastoma, a curable brain cancer. And he's in his early 50s, young children. And when he got the prognosis, he found himself in real time. And you got to know Danny, like he's such a researcher. He's got his iPhone on, talking to the iPhone by himself in emergency to kind of figure out what's going on. And he goes, why me? Why me? Why now? And he's in that. And he could feel this spike of fear. So it's like that tension, that emotion. And he knew in that moment that he needed to change the question to a much more generative, a question that was more opening up to possibilities. And he changed the question to what matters most now? What matters most now? And at that moment, he began to think about his children. And it took him to that Maslow's tend and befriend. And then that led him to that ability to tap into that part of his brain that's the executive function. So I love his work because he has done tremendous research. And how do we manage through the question we ask to tip ourselves from our fear base into our love base?
That is such an important practical tip. Okay, so paying attention to what our mind chatter is saying is really important in the moment.
And I think it even goes a little bit, it's that for me, I've been thinking a lot, and I'm very empathic, and I would talk about getting triggered easily. But what I realize is that when I sense a tension, whether it's with another person or something's happening or in my body, when I'm that's that whole thing about embodiment. So as soon as I start to feel that, then I need to ask, be curious. So my mentor, Jane Magruder Watkins, gave me a tip. And the T stands for when I start to get that feeling, it's this is not about you. Because I immediately assume that everything is about me. And therefore, that starts to trigger me. So if I, and then she learned this from the Dalai Lama, the I stands for, isn't that interesting? So what I've learned is when I start to feel that tension as it starts to go into, before I lose it in that half a second between stimulus and response, I then choose now to go, this isn't about me. You know, it's a quick thing. Now, sometimes it is about me, but that's a different story. And then I find the isn't that interesting takes me to the balcony. So it's a practice that allows me to disconnect. Now, it doesn't always work. So I want to be very clear, but at my best. And then the P stands for plan tight and hang loose. So in that situation, I look at it as go, don't let yourself just be triggered into reactive mode. It's like, let go, you're reactive, and then hang into what's possible.
Yes. Okay. So, so yesterday,
Mhm.
I start with Brittany and I say, that's it. I usually run around week to week, hour by hour, like my hair's on fire, running from this thing to that thing to this thing. And that's it. We're going to get a schedule. And I spent 2 hours with colored markers, hour and by hour, planning out what my week's gonna look like. And then I look at my phone at 6:45 a.m. on Monday morning, and our number one best dentalist, best most present dentalist is the one that has the most hours. She fell down the stairs, knocked herself unconscious, and broke her arm at the shoulder. Gone. So my husband is going to be short all these staff people, and I have to figure out how to make this work. And so my whole day was shot just like that. And I want to look up at the universe and say, didn't see I didn't see that one coming. But
And
I
I love it. I love it. And I think that's the number one thing right now, um, is it's not about change, about managing change, which is like is an oxymoron. And it's old language because the river I step in is not the river I stand in. We're always being in a flow of change. It's just a rush of change. I think it's about our ability to have the courage to deal with uncertainty. So you planned your day, that plan tight, and then uncertainty came at you and you had to hang loose. And that's the part of that emotional tension. So it's not you don't do it, it's your reaction to when something happens that takes us into that place of uncertainty. And I think that's we've spent 30 years or more. I mean, I worked in the corporate world, and I remember being a quality specialist in the early 80s, and the first female manager with on the manufacturing shop floor at pink steel-toed shoes. And we've been into efficiency for so long, and look what happened to us when COVID happened. All of our efficiencies went out the door. So we were efficient. We only had 6 weeks of masks available because it was efficient to only keep certain supply based on a certain usage. My background was distribution. So what's the economic order quantity? That didn't make sense when we suddenly needed billions of masks. So in complexity, we actually are, the more efficient we were, the harder it was for us to turn, if that makes sense. And I think that's what this last year has taught us is, yes, deal with efficiency in a complicated world, but how do we pivot and how do we deal with the uncertainty of the complex world that we live in?
I love that. I'm going to really think about tip. That is a nice little acronym, I suppose you'd call it. And I love this comment that you made a minute ago. The river we stepped in is not the one we're standing in.
That's actually, I always say the best, the best insights, t-shirts or signs. So there is a bridge across the Don River in Toronto, and that sign probably was built 100, maybe 70, 80 years ago. And I think it's such a great reminder because we think that everything is certain and it's all going to stay the same. I'm
Mhm.
standing on the same stone, but the world is flowing by. And now it's no longer flowing, it's gushing by. So,
Lovely. Okay, so before we move on, because I know you're going to do this, you're going to give us so many really practical tips. I love the tip. And I also love this sentence, and I don't want to move on because I might have done that better that yesterday morning. Instead of saying why, why? How can this be? Now what are we going to do? Because dental assistants are impossible to find in Vermont. Instead of doing those why questions for a half an hour, I could have said, what matters most right now? And I would have answered that way like I do, because I do function like an executive a good bit of the time, not like a crazy person. And I would have come up and I did shift faster than normal, but I'll tell you, it was I what matters most right now. I should call her and see if she's okay and see if she got good medical care and make sure that the my spare backup is all teed up. There's so many things I could have done besides the half hour of why.
yeah. Well, I think the key is to be kind to ourselves and bring in self compassion because I am the least compassionate person to myself. And so we go into that place of judgment. I always love it when people say, do unto others as you would have done to yourself. And you go, I wouldn't be that horrible to anybody else. So it's a negative bias. It's in all of our brains.
Mhm.
We go there. The question really is what to do, how to get it out. So I have a metaphor that I use for things like that. And do you know the game Snakes and Ladders or Snakes and
Sure.
Chutes? So
I
I
love
grew up
yeah,
Snakes and Ladders in
yeah,
Scotland. And so you throw the dice
yeah.
and you go up a ladder and you're really happy and you throw the dice and you go up another ladder or you just move along a couple. But then when you hit the chute or the snake and it takes you right into the pit, I can go to a place of judgment. It was just the luck of the draw.
Mhm.
It just happened. It's like you just it, it was whatever. And now what I've tried to do, and I don't always do it well, those people who know me, I can drive myself crazy. I go, I just landed in the pit. Where's the ladder? And I think that's the thing. So you can go to the why, but then you go, that's not doing me any good. How quickly can I go to the ladder?
Okay, and this kind of a mental transition can help us in all kinds of things, and things that are really worth grieving about, and things that are just going to add countless hours to our day that we hadn't expected. I mean, this I love this thinking. Now, you're using the term, which I love, but I don't know that I hear it often enough that I even understand it as well as I should. Talk to us about this term you've mentioned now twice called ask a more generative question. So, talk to us about the term generative.
Oh, and I think of the term generative. So I can ask a dull, bland question. How are you? Doesn't really tell you anything. I can ask you a judging question. Why did you do that? I can ask a question, and I think of the term generative in that sense that it opens up an energy, that it generates possibilities, that it's a question that I might go, wow, no one's ever asked me that question before. Like what matters most now? That's a generative question because it's allowing you, it's taking you future focused. It's tying into what matters, like into value, and it's opening you up to possibility. So I always think of a generative question as one that has a different kind of energy and feels more novel than questions that people are used to being asked, so they don't fall into that same. I When I came from Scotland to North America and I was 19, and people would say, hi, how are you, and I would start answering, and they would have walked past me, and I was appalled. I'm like, because in Glasgow you would say hello if you don't have time, hello, and if you had time, you'd say, oh, hello, how are you doing? And so I think there's so many questions that we have that we don't even pause to even check in what the question is. A generative question is one that you're deliberate. You're seeking for that person to have the opportunity to pause and hopefully take them perhaps to a conversation that they might not have been to before.
Mhm. It's lovely. Okay, so we can't be this close to the subject without talking about it. I want us to talk a little bit about this field of, I'd say, communication and organizational building called appreciative inquiry, which is how we met.
Yes,
Um,
indeed.
I know it's gonna open a million doors and windows for people, so I'm gonna take a quick break before we start there, and I'm gonna talk to people about this incredible next step that Ever Widening Circles has taken. We looked at the media landscape and kind of put our face in our hands about what's going on with social media, and we said, you know what? There needs to be a place where people who are doing good in the world can find each other. So we have created a social media network and personal development network called the Conspiracy of Goodness Network. So I'm going to take a break. We'll hear a little bit about that, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about appreciative inquiry because I think it's the next big thing. When you and I met, I had spoken at a an event for this way of communicating in the world. I mean, you're going to explain it better than I do. I always fall a little bit short on being able to explain appreciative inquiry. And I spoke at the very beginning of the event, and I was so taken by you all and everything that was going on, the energy, talking about energy in that room, that I stayed for the whole 3 days with you all and just just invited myself to the event. And Maureen and I just gravitated towards each other, and with every meal, we sat closer and closer, and here we are a couple of years later. So, Maureen, take it from the 10,000-foot look and introduce us to the other AI. That's how people can remember it when they're
Yeah.
going to look it up on the internet after they hear us talk. Appreciative inquiry. What is it?
I've actually got three different AIs. So there's artificial intelligence, I worked for the Department of Agriculture, so I know about artificial insemination. And then there is appreciative inquiry. And appreciative inquiry, I think of it like a philosophy that has methodology. And it really is around helping us create relationships that's very helpful, particularly when we're in positive, when we're trying to do positive change, like because we know change is happening. And so it's actually 30 some years old. So it started out at Case Western University with an undergraduate, David Cooper-Ryder, and he was doing his PhD in organizational development. And I love the story that he tells is that he went into the Cleveland Clinic. Now, for those of you who are old enough, in the mid 80s, we were getting into the whole problem set. So it was the 6-step problem solving model and everything had to be defined. What's the problem? And we were all, I mean, it was all new. So it was very, very, wow, this is the new stuff. And so David went in, and his client was the Cleveland Clinic. And he went in and he went, wow, this place is so extraordinary. If I only study what's wrong, what are the problems, I'll never learn what makes it so amazing and so unique. And so he went and his advisor, I won't say his name quite right, Shiraz Savasana, um, and Ron Fry was his professor. And Ron's a wonderful character, and he's still around Cleveland Case Western University. They began to talk about, as David said, might it be the method we use determines what we find?
Oh,
So when we go in and we've got a problem lens, and by the way, if my car breaks down, I want my mechanic to be very kind of problematic at assessing it. But in human systems, if someone comes at us with all the problems, we become very depleted. Our energy, we get into a blame frame, we get into, withdrawal kind of thing. So he began this whole thing, and it actually started as appreciative research, appreciative analysis. So it was an action, and he used Kurt Lewin's action research model, and he reframed it. And so that's what it started off was let me go out and let me interview, which again is different. Let me ask you stories rather than filling out a sheet. And so he began to work on this and noticed that people were coming forward sharing all sorts of information that led to better solutions than if he only had worked on get it from we have a deviant, and this is Kim Cameron's work, and we're very focused when we say there's a gap analysis. So imagine in the middle of this line is kind of like neutral, and then you've got to the left, that's when something's gone wrong. So I've got health and I've got illness. We study that left part of the deviance, but the right part of the deviance is for human systems even more important. And that's like, how do I get to flourishing? So David was looking at, where are the people flourishing? What is working here? And when we start off by focusing on the strengths of a system, not ignoring the problems and the issues, it gives us the energy and the courage to move into how do we fix it. So his thing is, you start with studying the past to learn what has been working. And it's not about what's your best experience. Like during COVID, you don't say, what was your best experience of COVID? You start off by saying, wow, to be in lockdown, to lose jobs, to be friends and family, threats of illness, that's a really terrifying time. What gave you the courage and strength to get through it? So we focus on the learning, and I like to call it was a client of mine, it was the MS Society, and they said it's like you bring your luggage, not your baggage, onto the plane. And we know with refugees or anyone, I'm an immigrant, if I can bring something from my past that's meaningful to me, I can go into my future with more confidence. That's one of the uniquenesses I find, is that there's not many, I can't think of any other change process that lets me start off with what I can bring into the future. And then you go into, well, let's imagine, let's co-create the image, the future we want. And then suddenly you've got people describing it. And as you describe it, you envision it. And then we've got the shared image of what it is. And then you say, okay, now how do I move forward? And so that's, I think of, I even got the AI salsa, the appreciative inquiry salsa. So you stand grounded in the present, you put a step into the back to bring the past, you come back into the present, you step into the future, you come back into the present. So there's a rhythm to it.
I,
And so it can be as simple or as complicated, but that's I think the difference about it. Dialogic is story-based, is the best of what was, is, and can be.
so let me, what I find about appreciative inquiry is sometimes I can't get my head around it. It seems almost too academic, too formulaic. So I'll tell you what happened to me and how I got my head around it, and how I began to use what Mo is going to talk to us about here. I came back from this conference and I was so full of appreciative inquiry. I was just brimming. And so, of course, weren't we right in the middle of some hot issue at Fiddlehead Dental? And I brought all the staff in and I said, okay, here's the most important question I got out of this appreciative inquiry meeting. What do we all want more of?
Yes.
I love this question when you're problem solving. And it is impossible to stay on that question unless you really work at it as a group. Because so I said, okay, so we're having this big problem. I think we were just, my husband and I were just too rigid about people taking time off. We just needed every single body there every day, and they were working sick, and it was years ago. We weren't as good then. So I said, what do we all want more of? And what everybody fell into was what they all want less of. And
Yeah.
I could not keep the conversation on what we could agree upon. What do we all want more of? It's is it human nature, Mo? Is it, if we sat down with our teenager who's coming in too late, past curfew all the time, and we said, Jonathan, let's you and I talk knee to knee. What do we both want more of? And the
Well,
conversation would devolve every time to, I don't want you doing this, and Mom, I don't want you doing that. It's hard to stay on what we all want more of.
well, I think the thing is, I use the question, what do we want more of when we're designing the conversation?
Okay.
So I may not take it into the group as that beginning point. So it's that design. So I'd be talking to, so you want to get together with your staff. And what it can do is help you create an inquiry that isn't that's more, and I'm going back to that word generative. So let me give you my favorite example of this is a colleague years ago, Diana Whitney, worked with British Airways at Kennedy International Airport. And they said, okay, this appreciative inquiry stuff for relationship building, that's kind of okay. But what about a real problem? And she said, well, give me one. And they said, lost luggage. And every airline's had that. Now, no one gets, I used to do a lot of QIP, quality improvement projects. No one's going to get excited about lost luggage because they've been doing it for a while. So from an appreciative point of view, you say to the client, well, what will you get more of if you focus on lost luggage? And they go, well, we'll get better service recovery. Well, what will better service recovery get you? Well, and they go on and you push. I had one client that said, Mo, you're really aggravating me. And I think, okay, now I know to stop pushing. Right. And so they ended up with creating an exceptional arrival experience. So the topic went from lost luggage to an exceptional arrival experience. Then you go into the inquiry with the staff. Tell me about a time when you experienced an exceptional arrival experience. What was happening? Blah, blah, blah. So I think about what do you want more of as more of a definition of the project question than I do as actually gathering the people around
Uh-huh.
to get started. And I can share it with you, a little framework, AIR,
Okay.
and it will then give you some examples of how you could get your staff involved. But when you're pausing to think, what do we want to go into the staff? So if you then came up with, we want to create an environment where everyone feels valued and their needs are met or something like that, so that we are a practice that cares about our staff as much as we care about our patients, or something
Right.
along those
Great.
lines.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Then you can go into tell me a story about a time. But so I think that's the thing is that when we hear one piece, we don't realize that it really is like a system.
Yeah.
And, your comment about when you talk to people and they keep going to what they don't want. So I find people will do that. And I go, wow, it sounds like, Linda, you really have a vision. You're so passionate about what you don't want. I imagine that's because you have an idea of what you do want. Tell me what that looks like. And they're not used to that. They're used to showing up and telling you all the problems when I was a quality specialist. And then I'd go away and I think I knew what their answer was. And I would come back with a solution, which often was like a heart transplant with a heart that had never been tested and immediately rejected the solution. I got accolades because I came up with a solution and they got into trouble for not making it work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and I remember doing a lot of work with one community engagement group around complex needs, children with complex needs. And it was like 26 agencies, 3 hospitals, 2 school boards all together, and parents and everyone. And everyone kept telling me what they didn't want.
Right.
And so I laughed. And so I jokingly said, and I worked with them so they kind of knew me. And I said, it's like my girlfriend who said to her husband at Christmas, don't you buy me a dishwasher. He bought her a vacuum cleaner. So if you don't tell me what you need to tell me
Right.
what, that's why we create the image of the future together.
Mhm.
So if
Absolutely.
you're with your teenagers, so let's just talk about it. Imagine that it's 3 months from now and you think about it, and we're in harmony and you're kind of getting some of your needs. What does that look like? How have we come up with a solution? So that's the part of it. So people will go to, if you let them, here's everything that's wrong. And then my way, and we talk about it, name it, flip it, frame it. How do people will say, we don't want bullying. So then they do anti-bullying. Well, anti-bullying, you're just learning a lot about anti-bullying. So then you flipped it, but now where do you want to frame it? And so schools I work with would come up with creating a safe and inclusive school.
What they
So
really
you
want. Right.
and then you're willing to ask the kids, you're willing to ask the janitor, you're willing to ask the librarian, you're asking parents. So that's the difference with appreciative inquiry. It says if you really want to make a system-wide change, you've got to involve them in the conversation.
Hmm. And find out what people want.
And then you take them to the design and you say, now how will we make our image happen? So we're not giving off to a little team in the side. We
Yeah.
each have responsibility. When we leave the room, we'll often say, what's the smallest change or action you will take to move forward the vision we've described and created together today?
Oh, that's such
And I get them to maybe write it on a card and I mail it to them 2 weeks later. I get them to have a learning buddy. They do. So the key is that I don't know any other change process that starts off with let's create what we do want. Let's aim towards what we want. Let's lift it high enough. Now let's decide who are all of the people that are going to be impacted by this, and let's bring them into the conversation, if not all of them, representation from those different stakeholder groups.
Mhm. So I love another question. I keep 7 appreciative inquiries on the wall in both my offices here at home and in the office. Another question I really love is what do we all care about?
Mhm.
That when I have asked that, my breath is taken away. When I actually give people a safe environment to go around the table, and people that hardly ever speak in the meetings say the darndest things that open my eyes.
And I think that's the importance, is that we've lived in a world of efficiency, so let's get to the end of the meeting faster.
Yeah.
And I think COVID has taught people that an appreciative inquiry. I used to, Jane and I would talk about, the efficiency. If we've got this line of here's the beginning of a change and here's where we want it to end, we would get a small group together, we would come up with this, and then we'd start trying to implement it, and we'd notice that the energy would just fade away. An appreciative inquiry, by having let people on your own jot down, what do you really care about? I might even say, if people are not yet comfortable, go into pairs or triads and share what you care about with each other. So now I've got this smaller group. And then the group comes back and says, here's what we care about. And then you start to notice the patterns, the themes that arrive. And then because they've told it as a story, so tell me a story about a time when you something really cared about. And when it's story based and we hear each other's story,
Mhm.
we don't get into the idea, we used to talk about form, storm, norm, perform when teams come together. That's how I found appreciative inquiry in the 90s. Jervis Bush wrote an article, How to Take Storming Out of Team Building.
Ah,
And it was, let's start by telling me a story about your best team experience. What did you care? What mattered about it? And we each tell a story, and then we see patterns,
mhm.
and then we create our things from that. So it's slowing down. So I think COVID is kind of like, it's like one person at a time, and then you infect them, and then you kind of like you go on to the next, and then like the lily pads, by the time the lake is half filled with lilies, how long does it take for the whole lake? One day.
Right.
And so I see appreciative inquiry is this, it starts off slower, but then it has the exponential growth.
Well, it's like many things that 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 need a shift, not a giant shift, but a small shift in our perspective.
And that's why the most powerful question I find when you've gone through this exercise, what is the smallest change or action? What is the smallest change or action you will commit to do?
So this is how I've been thinking a lot about the various stages that we're all in the COVID situation. And here in the United States, we're all deciding what's next. Do we go back to work? Do we stay at home and keep running off doing laundry in between calls? And that worked for a lot of people. It didn't work for others. And like as we navigate what we decide to, I think of it like this. I think COVID forced everybody's entire garage just launched out onto the pavement in their driveway, and we could see everything that we'd been keeping in our garage in the light of day.
Mhm.
And some things are going to be very easy to say, well, I'm not putting that back in there. And then there's many things that are like, oh my gosh, I was looking for that forever, and I'm going to put that up front so I can reach for it when I want it. And then there'll be other things we have to decide upon. But I think COVID is going to turn out to be this great opportunity to have sort of clean the garage of our life and decide what's important to take back and protect and have handy.
I love that as a metaphor. And that's the other thing, appreciative inquiry use metaphor, because words create worlds. So the language we use and the images, the metaphors, because our brain works on that kind of imagery. So I love that as a way to look at COVID. And I think personally, I feel like what happened is, and I've been using, now you remember Y2K.
Yes. But a lot of people won't. Brittany
No,
won't.
I know. That's why I'm just, so Y2K was the year. It was midnight on December 31st, 1999. Now, for those of us who were working in the 70s, computer storage was so expensive that we didn't store 1972. We only stored 72. So the big fear was that when the year 2000 came, the world would collapse because we had to then have, 2000. So we went to a 4 digit rather than two. And this is my very basic memory of it. And there was this fear, and it caused corporations and government and everyone to upgrade their operating system platforms, because we were all so afraid that everything would collapse. And in fact, there was all sorts of theories out there. When midnight landed and whatever it was in the world that it started, there would be this kind of breakdown of computer systems, and nothing happened. That was because people had put the time in. So I don't believe that we would have had the dot-com and the tech, the world that we're in today, if we hadn't globally done Y2K.
Mhm.
So the fact that we can do Zoom all over the world is because that foundation, the fiber optics across the ocean, all sorts of stuff. I think, and I'm making this up, so just take this as outrageous. I think COVID is like upgrade of our operating systems for our minds and our emotions. So it's like 2.0, because now people know what exponential growth is and how do we flatten the curve or how do we accelerate it. People have have flipped into e-health. You know, that existed for many years, but people were resistant. We flipped into so many things and we've done it for so long, it wasn't 3 months, that we will never go back, even though school systems are wanting traditional. Like, we have flipped globally. So I think of it as the Y2K upgrade of our minds and our emotions.
Absolutely. I do too. I did a big speaking engagement for a bunch of teachers. And that's the thing I opened with was, wow, what they've been doing on the fly
That's
to
right.
revolutionize. The last time there was a serious upgrade in education was like 110 years ago.
Exactly, exactly. And it's so exciting because I know I've gone to my teachers' friends and said, what do you do? And they were saying, well, use Padlet, use this, because they have to come up with inexpensive, simple solutions. So the educators I have found have been my best resource to help me move forward. And so the world will never go back, just like we'll never go back to 2-digit years in
Yes.
our systems. And I think that's the yin and the yang. That's the terrifying part, because that's now we're in this uncertainty. And there's a woman, Maureen O'Hara, wrote a book about 12 contingencies for an unexpected emergency or something. I've totally got the name wrong, but I can share it with you. And in it, she talked about, and wrote this 2009, we must be the palliative caregivers to the dying culture and midwives to the new. Our children are the only natives, so we must get ahead to help educate them. Some of us will be immigrants, and most of us will be refugees.
That is the way it is. That is the way it is. And I think it ties into something I'd love for you to comment on. I published a book in September 1st during the pandemic called Happiness is an Option.
Yes.
And it was written in about 6 weeks. I don't know. It just spilled out like it came from somewhere else. And it's a commentary on what we do next with the role of the internet in our lives. And one of the quotes in the book that I love that makes me think this has been building this reckoning with the way we had our real lives and then the way we have our online lives. And um, I there's this great quote by Carl Sagan. Do you remember good old Carl Sagan? For people who don't, Carl was the first science communicator. Like, he came before Bill Nye and all the other wonderful, great science communicators. Carl Sagan talked about billions and billions of stars, and he had us mostly looking up at the sky, every single human being on the planet in the 90s, in a new way. So Carl Sagan, people used to ask him all the time, because that's what he was an astrophysicist. They used to say, Carl, oh, do you think we'll ever get to Mars? And he used to answer back, I think a better question is, who will we have to become to be able to get to Mars? He was, I believe, imagining human being 2.0.
Yeah.
Because the operating system that we're using that is clearly on display in the internet is all about outrage and fear and scarcity and our worst, most primitive leftover impulses from 40,000 years ago during the Stone Age, and we're still using them to navigate the modern world, let alone the internet. And so talk to us about your thoughts on what comes next, like related to appreciative inquiry, or the patterns you've seen over the years in people's opening their minds, opening to what's possible in business and communication.
Sure. Um, One, I just want to acknowledge what a wonderful reframe. You know, it's like the why and the what is like, who do we have to be? And I think that's we've grown up with the 7 why questions,
Right.
you know, from that. And human systems, most of us don't respond well to the whys. We respond more. So who do we have to become is a beautiful generative question. because it's just out there. And it's like, wow, nobody's ever asked me that question before. And I remember a client of mine who ran a youth mental health agency, and it was probably, he ran the most complex one in the province. He had 150 staff, and he was doing, this was about 15 years ago, his PhD using appreciative inquiry on this whole concept of what is a strength-based organization. And he used to say, I worry that there are too few people who have the mental capacity to think in this complexity that we're moving into. And I feel like this last year and a half has helped to grow that number. And it doesn't have to be a big number, but it has to be 5, 10%. I mean, it can't be 0.2% of the population can handle this. And I always remember that was one of his big questions, was that from a mental health standpoint. So I think we've almost moved back, and this is why I loved Danny's work on the amygdala and the brain. So now that we know that that's the old brain, we're living in a world that's actually having fun. I think maybe fun's not the right, but it's certainly, there's a lot of people out there that want to just trigger our amygdalas.
Yes, that's it.
And it's like whack-a-mole. I'll say something outrageous, and then I'll say something outrageous, and then everybody jumps into this simple response to that reaction, instead of going, like, let's assume, Linda, you and I know each other. Let's pause for a moment and, like, tell me more. I'm really curious about why you think that that is the case. I need to understand you. So I don't think there's enough curiosity. I think there's so much judgment, because it's like an on-off switch. And we're living in a world, instead of either or, and a world of both and that takes a whole lot more of our emotional energy to hold two opposing ideas and build attention.
Let's stay there for a second. I think we should stay right there. I'm constantly reminded throughout my days about how black and white people wish the world was. And so when it's not, they sort of force it there. There's right and wrong, and there's nothing in between. Or there's you're bad and I'm good, or you're smart and I'm dumb, or whatever it is. That's a dumb idea, or that's a smart idea. There's no room for this wonderful gray that is where all the best ideas of humanity has ever come from.
And I think I'm going to challenge you a little where you were saying there's no room. I think there is some room. It's not yet enough.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that for
No,
me,
no, no, I
but
know that, but I'm just saying for
yeah,
those who are listening, because I
yeah.
know that I mean, that's what the conspiracy of goodness is let's find those spaces. And, you know, we need to be very careful, because I think, I'm old enough to remember when people used to sit down and read several newspapers, and they were large articles, and there was a lot of journalists that were hired to do this. And now it feels like if you only were kind of skimming BBC, CBC, that's the Canadian broadcast, I might look at, CNN, Fox, whatever I'm looking at. I believe there's like 3 journalists that seem to get their stories published, because it doesn't matter which one you go to, it's the same headlines.
Yeah,
So the question is we become addicted to quick responses. And I think the answer, and this is where something like a dialogic approach, like appreciative inquiry and other great processes, we're starting to see in the certain communities saying we've got to slow down and have conversation. We've got to listen to each other, because and this is something I learned from working with Jane and from David Cooperrider is, and I think it might have been Meg Wheatley, you cannot hate someone whose story you know.
I love that.
And so that's where I think we're at, is that we need to take the time, like you and I, we can be busy, but when we come together, we have this time to explore rather than text. And don't get me wrong, my nephew and one of my nephews, we have great connections through texting. So I don't want to dismiss it, because I think it can be very effective. But I think I really do believe that the work that Danny has done around, and the work, you're the pause, like all of, and the work I'm doing with the pause is, until we learn how to train our emotional responses, and that, that there's a place between, stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl talked about it. Many people have. I think that's the great lesson. And so in leadership, what I'm seeing is the progressive places are saying, we don't need more competencies. Let's not teach you how to give or receive feedback more. We need to help you as a leader understand your emotional development, which many call vertical development. So that there's a person I really like, Alan Watkins,
Oh,
and his
I love
business.
Ellen Watkins. Yeah.
I know he's just great. And he wrote, we could go off on a little tangent about that, and I don't want to take people off in that way, but it's, Alan has been a great believer in the coherence. We need to get our heart and head, because the parasympathetic muscle runs through us. And if we can come from a heartfelt place, we can actually calm the amygdala. And so it is about needing to move, as he says, most people, they get to 40, a baby, the first year, you don't even know you're separate. And he shows a picture of a baby biting its toe and biting its soother. Ooh, that hurts. Oh, then is the 2-year-old sobbing, going, what's wrong with you? We're in pain, we're emotionally distraught, and then it realizes that it's separate. And then you go to the next stage of roles, where you can tease a kid and go, the cat goes woof, no, 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 the cat goes meow. And so you get into that, and then you get up to the 14, so you get into these different cognitive stages. And he said, and then we go out into the world, and the society starts imposing these things, like you're supposed to be married, you're supposed to be this, and then we kind of go back to being like 14 again. And I love it. He'll say many executives are like throwing toys out of prams. They have no emotional management. And so I feel like that's where do we need to go next, to have as many leaders as possible, informal, formal, who understand self-awareness,
Hmm.
and can understand and look at what's going on around them. And so that's where I feel is the next stage.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd love people to take away from our conversation here today is that there's just a world of possibilities out there about our reactions to every single moment in our days. And that, I wouldn't know about appreciative inquiry unless I stayed that day. You have to show up.
Yes.
You have to show up for new ideas. You have to show up for learning. You have to show up for listening. That's one of the things I say at the end of the Power of the Pause TEDx talk, is that one of the things that I've learned the most from in my life, operating from the heart,
Yeah.
is when I can compose myself and listen to understand, not to ready what I want to say next. And when I can get into that mode, I do what you spoke about happens. I say, tell me more. And oh my goodness, I, I don't understand, you know, and I keep getting the person to tell me more and more and more about their story. And by the end, they're rarely someone I can be angry with.
Ah,
Rarely.
and you can then come to, I mean, I love William Urey's work out of Harvard negotiation. And he talks about the easiest thing you can give someone when you're in that type of conflict, and he deals with the most complex conflicts in the world, is to give them respect. I might not like what you're doing. I respect that it's coming from somewhere. Help me understand. And that's what appreciative inquiry I was taught was by my mentor. She worked all over the world. She said, we need to respect where that person's coming from. And can I share with you just some values that I've been playing with just very quickly?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I've been playing with this idea of moving from knower, Knower, to explorer with an abundant mindset. And in that, what
So just to be clear, knower, like thinking that you know
that's
everything.
right. Yeah. So I don't, hold on a second. I went to the wrong piece here.
Knower to
Knower
explorer.
to
I love that.
explorer.
Okay.
And so if you recall the world that you and I grew up in, it was all about knowing. You
Yes.
never asked a question at Xerox when you went to the executive, because people would say, well, you're not supposed to not know, right? So knower to explorer with
Yeah.
an abundant mindset, which is like to be an appreciative. And I've been playing with these. I got some of these values from EDS in 1995 when they went knower to learner, and now 26 years later. And I think the first one is the courage to face uncertainty, because to be prepared that the ground underneath my feet will never be completely calm, and therefore the humility to know that you don't know it all, and then the curiosity to actively uncover new information by asking learning and generative, not judging questions. And then this one is the one, so some of these came from EDS back in the day, and this one I love: trust that people are doing the best they can with the worldview that they have.
That's huge.
That one for me, 1995, Texas. I was in Dallas. I was in a room that had no windows, and I stopped. My world changed with that one. Therefore, I use empathy to actively seek to make coherence of the other. And then the last, it used to be self-esteem, which was a big thing in the 90s. And I changed it to self-awareness, willing to explore ourselves and our impact on others, which is when we talk about that, why to what. And so that's something that I've just been working on over the last couple of days, but it all began 26 years ago.
Can we maybe we can share that in the show
Yes.
notes?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Okay, go through the what's that comment that made me take my breath? That left you that same way in the
Oh,
hotel
the
room?
trust that the person that understand that their worldview. I'll have to actually, because it just took me away. Trust that people are doing their best based on the worldview that they have, and
Right.
so that's that point of saying, I'm appalled. My reaction is to feel appalled, hurt, upset, but I trust that there is something that I don't comprehend about what you're saying. And that's what William Ury talks about in that, is seeking to understand.
Yeah.
And my dad used to say, and he died in 1975, but it's about agreeing to disagree. So there's that moment when I may never get to understand where you're at, but I respect what got you there. Um, and it's like, what is it? Pema Chodron is a Buddhist, a Canadian Buddhist monk, and there's a practice she has that says, you're sitting in the street, you're sitting somewhere in a park, and you look at people and you say, just like me. You have hopes and dreams just like me. You have fears just like me. And the idea is, how do we see everyone in the way that they are just, they're human beings? It's a huge thing. I can't get there for
Yeah.
everything and everyone, but it just
Well,
isn't.
and this is important, Mo, isn't it? That we can't get there with everyone. Like, as we're having this conversation in this exact moment, I'm thinking of some of the biggest problems that are going on. And you and I agree that we don't like to talk politics, and we're not going to go there even now. But I think about some of the biggest issues, and what I hear people say when I can pull off the equanimity to actually offer that kind of perspective that you just offered, that I always say, everyone's carrying a burden. Everyone. Every single person. And some carry their burdens better than others. And some carry their burdens for a while better than others and then don't. It all spills out. And so that's how I come to have some compassion for people I really disagree with vehemently. But when I always get pushback from somebody who's out there fighting a good fight for a cause, they always give me this pushback, and maybe it's a good time to close, and then we're going to have another conversation for sure. But the pushback I get, which I'd love to have your opinion on, is, yeah, but I'm willing to go into that conversation and concede understanding and ask more questions and so forth, but they aren't. They're going to be just waiting to make their point to me. Like, how do we deal with this? Sure, if if everybody could have the same level of equanimity, then we could have the hard conversations, but it doesn't work that way.
Well, I always think when they say they, how many fingers are pointing back at them?
Okay.
They,
Okay.
so you get 4 fingers pointing back at yourself.
Yeah.
I always like to say to people, you know what, if I could change the world in this short period of time, I used to say this, it doesn't work anymore. I'd be selling infomercials at 3 a.m., which of course generations won't even know what that is. But in the days of only TV as a medium, when there was nothing else running. So I don't profess in any way to have the answer. And I think it becomes like it's like one person at a time. And you invite the people who it's like you go where we used to, what I believe in is you go where the energy is. So you don't try and change the whole system. You try and say, okay, how can I, and that's like COVID. You have one, I always say, if I can have one conversation of possibility with a stranger, which has been tough through COVID, but you go into stores or whatever, I will change the world. So it's like remember the movie The Starfish, the young guy's throwing starfish back and there's thousands around and someone says, well, you're not going to make much of a difference. It made a difference for that one. So I think if we use the positive side of the virus, and that was my talk actually, the AI Jam online, it was how do we positively infect people in a way that it becomes contagious. And so I think the other is we need to start talking to the people who have a different perspective. Like we've gone into more of the world of debate than dialogue. And a friend of mine who was talking about doing some work in Denver Art Gallery, which was very traditionally of a particular class and race and everything, and they wanted to make it more diverse. And she said, I reached out to the people I knew from the different diversity representation. And I said, you may not want to come to speak at this with us, but I would really love it if you would come as my friend. And so I think it's like, what do? You tap on the shoulder of someone who cares and ask them to bring someone. I can't think of, I mean,
It's going to be a one by one thing.
however, COVID has taught us when you get halfway, it just doubles. So, like, don't get despair around that. Just imagine that you're not flattening, but you're accelerating the curve. You're encouraging people to unmask themselves and speak their truth.
This is a lovely conversation that we're going to have to continue. So, Mo, can you share with us? So every single thing, Mo is always like this. She's a font of knowledge. She has an amazing memory for people and books
And it's not accurate. Remember, it's not
okay.
accurate.
We're gonna get every one of them in the show notes, and we'll get them accurate because these are very important places for you to go down some rabbit holes. If you're gonna go down rabbit holes, these are places that will leave you expanded. I know that every rabbit hole I've ever gone down that Mo has has given me, I have come out a transformed person. So thank you for sharing this with us. So Mo, where can people connect with your work?
Um, so I am like the kind of least easy person to reach. I will put in my website, Return on Energy. I'm starting to push myself to do some things, which is, around maybe using Racket, which is what I used for something. So the best way to reach me initially is you can go to my website or you can just send me an email or contact me. I'm kind of like always under the radar. But I would be delighted if anyone reaches out. I would be more than happy to have a conversation with anyone who does. So,
All right. Well, you are shining a light on many parts of the world that are just outside our reality shadow and are right there for us to take advantage of. So thank you so much for taking us places we couldn't have gone without you today.
thank you. I love the work you're doing.
Well, we are going to have Mo back another day, and we will continue to share some of the wonder of this this way of communicating and thinking about human interaction that we talked about today. Appreciative inquiry. It's one of my passionate ways to think about what's possible for humanity. And please go rate the podcast if you want to help expand this kind of positive media. The best thing you can do is help us get over the next hump. We are in the top 25% of podcasts in the world. We're wanting to get into that top 10%. And the best way to do that is to go rate and review the podcast. And remember to check out the Conspiracy of Goodness Network. That is where you'll find like-minded people if you want a better world. That's where people are going to come together to exchange resources and ideas, and it's a lovely place to have your faith in humanity restored. I hope all these connections to goodness and progress carry you through your week and you start finding all the joy and wonder that Mo and I have been talking about today. Thank you so much.